Hello and welcome to our next episode of 25 Live at Home. We are so glad that you joined us this week. We're going to get started with our gospel lesson today. Today we are actually in John. We've been in Mark for a really long time if you've been paying attention. We're working on John 18 verses 33 to 37. Now this is an interesting passage this week because it's kind of like we've jumped ahead to the end of Jesus' life, while in this coming season of Advent, we're getting ready for Jesus' birth. So let's listen this morning and see what we might be thinking about. So first, let's read our gospel text this morning. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Amen. So, we're going to start our Bible verse this week and start breaking down our story. I want to start with who. I think it's appropriate to begin our discussion with who is in this passage. We begin with Jesus, and we are only days away from the crucifixion. Jesus has been arrested and questioned by the Pharisees, who have accused him of heresy. However, they don't feel as if they'd be able to carry out the punishment on their own, because many of the followers that he had would have turned the crowds against the Jewish leadership. So instead, they came up with this scheme to turn him over to Pontius Pilate, the Roman leader in Jerusalem at the time. As the prefect of Judea, he was directly responsible for answering to those above him, but he was ruling over this region. Those would have been Julius Caesar. That is who Pilate answered to. So he was ensuring that taxes were enforced and peace was kept. He was in charge of this whole region of Judea where Jerusalem is. And that's what Pilate's job is, and that's where he comes in today, as this person who has been handed Jesus and told that Jesus is a dangerous man and he needs to be held accountable for crimes against the Jewish leadership. So as we think about when and where our story happens today, it's somewhere in the Roman headquarters in Jerusalem. And we're only days away from Passover celebrations that we've talked about before. The Jewish people are getting ready to celebrate Passover, this huge festival that's extremely important to their faith. This time when they celebrate their coming out of Egypt, out of the ruling of Pharaoh. Now, most people recognize that this turning over that would become the crucifixion of Jesus would happen between AD 30 and AD 33 as the year of the crucifixion. So what's going on in our story this morning? Well, as we think about the events of our story, Pilate doesn't necessarily want to crucify Jesus. Think about this like a parent dealing with two of their children fighting, and one of them is accusing the other. So the parent, of course, is trying to get all the details about what happened and just can't quite figure out what's going on because the kids are just bickering back and forth. Well, that's what's happening here this morning. That's what Pilate's dealing with. He's taken the accusations of the Pharisees and has Jesus in his custody. He knows that Jerusalem is abuzz, that Jesus just came in riding on a donkey a few days ago, and it created this whole scene and this whole buzz. And Pilate's job is to keep the peace and keep things in order for Roman leadership. So that would have been a little concerning to him, that there would have been this big buzz around the town. So he's interrogating Jesus about the accusation of heresy, which means false claims against God. The Romans are not accusing him of this, but instead it's the Jews. Pilate has been told that Jesus claims to be God or king-like. So he asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus simply replies, "Is that what you are asking or what you've been told to ask?" And Pilate answers with another question. "Am I a Jew?" he says, which he would not have been right? He's Roman. He reminds Jesus that it was actually the Jewish people, the Pharisees, who turned him over to him. And Jesus ends this conversation in a statement that, one in power would have had a really hard time understanding. My kingdom is not of this world. That would have been a very strange concept to Pilate. So why are we talking about this right before Advent, this great season of joy? Well, I think this is the point. Jesus was a misfit here on earth. Both Roman and Jewish leadership alike came to see Jesus as a threat to what was normal or the status quo. The Pharisees plotted and schemed at how they could trick Jesus into heresy or into saying the wrong thing, and eventually tried to have him killed for it. Jesus would not have been welcome as an insider or as someone who was in the in crowd in this world. And even the company Jesus kept was misfits, whether it was tax collectors or prostitutes or people who were seen as unclean. Jesus was a misfit. Now, Jesus didn't run around with the folks that the Pharisees would have liked him to. He didn't hold himself up to this high standard above other people. No, instead, Jesus came to serve. Jesus came to wash people's feet, to share the cup with other people, to share bread with other people, regardless of who they were. He came from a place in the world where he upset those people in power by his messaging of radical love, acceptance, and inclusion for all. He was labeled as the other, not adored by those in power here on earth. He was misfit and cast out, leading a lifelong journey to the cross where he died for the sins of all people, not just the Christian, the wealthy, or the powerful. So as we go into this week, what can we take from this? We can take from this that Jesus doesn't call us to seek power over other people. Jesus doesn't call us to be the most important person in the room. Jesus calls us to be the servant in the room, to have that Christ-like servant heart. So as we go into this season of Advent, I want us to think about how we can be a people who serve and who love in the way that Jesus loved. Because as we know, like Jesus is saying here, our kingdom is not necessarily of this world. We have to live in it, and we're here to serve and make it a better place. But we know that through Christ, we will follow to a place where we will truly have our kingdom. And all God's people said, Amen.
Good morning. This morning we're here with Helen Bryce, and we're excited to work on our next 25 Live series at home. And we would love it if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, so I'm Helen Bryce. And some of you might know me because I've been your Sunday school teacher. I've been a Sunday school teacher here for a while. So I get to meet lots of you and your families, or maybe your older brothers or sisters. And so I do that at church, and I do a few other things at church. So sometimes you see me around, and I am a scientist in real life, and the thing that I studied was a science called astronomy, and that is the study of looking at the stars and other, we'll call them celestial objects, and learning more about them and learning more about how the universe works.
Nice. That sounds very interesting.
I find it really interesting.
Yeah. So using your knowledge of astronomy, what do you think Luke was referring to when he said there will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars?
Well, this is such an interesting question, because when you think about different sciences, astronomy is maybe the science that humans have been doing for the longest time. And we know from archaeology and the remains of, buildings around us that people on Earth have been following the sun through the sky for thousands of years. And they've been setting up, like we think about stone circles, and the way that those are set up, the people at the time could work out the time of year but also they were starting to be able to do things like predict eclipses. So people have known that for thousands of years. Now, not everybody knows that, but when we talk about signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, I think one of the things that people are thinking about there is maybe eclipses. And a solar eclipse is when the moon casts its shadow on the earth. And we had one here in North America in April, and it was super dramatic. Maybe you got to see part of it. But so humans on Earth have been studying these events, and because they're so dramatic, the whole sky getting dark. And so like one of the kind of first things in science, because science is the systematic putting together observations in a way to get a bigger picture, is starting to work out what all those eclipses have in common. And so as modern day folks, we know that folks thousands of years ago were starting to be able to predict things like eclipses. So when Luke is saying about signs in the sun and the moon, I think he's maybe referring to things like eclipses, because eclipses are so dramatic, and I don't think everybody on planet Earth in biblical times knew how to predict eclipses. And there's certainly a case of a really famous battle in Greece where one side was able to predict the eclipse and the other side didn't, so they used that power of knowledge to gain a victory in that battle. So I think Luke's saying one of these really big signs is going to be it. And then the stars are interesting as well, because like in biblical times, and really until quite recently, people felt that the stars were unchanging. That the stars were placed and completely unchanging. So you wouldn't really see new stars appearing, you wouldn't see old stars disappearing. But actually we do see stars appearing. We call them nova, and that is that nova is the Latin word for new. So like a new star can appear, and that often happens, we know now, where most of the stars in the universe are actually in binary systems, or tend to be in binary systems. Our solar system's kind of unusual because we only have one star. And you know what the name of that star is, and I'm sure our friends at home do as well. But most stars, and so in this binary system, what can happen is as these stars kind of use up their nuclear fuel, they shed their outer layers, and you're left with one really small star called a white dwarf. And white dwarfs are really hot. And then as the other star starts to shed its outer layers, those layers accrete is the word in science we use, onto the white dwarf. That means they gather onto the white dwarf. So the white dwarf gets this kind of thick atmosphere of hydrogen, and then there's a sudden kind of ignition of hydrogen fusion on the surface of that star, and that makes it look like a new star. So astronomers could see these with the naked eye. It's really hard. They only come maybe a couple of centuries with the naked eye, but certainly there was records of these types of events, and so that's these changing heavens that people didn't expect to change. And I think lots of us can find change hard and kind of try to predict change. And I think when there's someone who can predict that change, you might think they're really wise and they could predict all these different changes, when actually they've just been really good at noticing. Yeah.
I learned something new today.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We often talk about the Christmas star during this time of year. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that was and how maybe some astronomers have viewed that in relation to the story of Jesus' birth?
It's such a great question, is it? Because we don't actually know what that star was. So there's a few really good contenders. Okay, so I'm going to go with those contenders from our solar system out, if that makes sense. So our solar system with the sun at the center and the planets. Now, in biblical times, folks did not fully know that the earth was moving around the sun. That's something we now know, and there's enough information to tell that, but people weren't completely sure. There's definitely evidence that in biblical time, people knew, or some people knew, that the earth was spherical, but not everybody. I guess if you're a carpenter and learning about woodworking, you probably wouldn't learn that or if you're a fisherman, you probably wouldn't learn that the world was a sphere. But so we now know that there's planets in the solar system, and planets mean wandering stars. So the people used to think that what we now know as Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, they used to think those were stars that moved, but they move in a very regular way, so they were well predicted. So one of the kind of solar system reasons for a Christmas star would be something called a conjunction, and that's when two of the planets, or three or four, can appear to be coming from the same place. So that sounds like really hard to spot, but the other thing I want to say about biblical times that makes it better for doing astronomy is nowadays when we go outside at night, there's a lot of what we call light pollution, because there's lots of buildings like our church that leave their lights on, and parking lots and roads, and all of these things are sort of for our safety and keeping everyone kind of keeping everyone safe and not falling over things in the dark. But we didn't have electrical light a few hundred years ago, so the stars would have been even more impressive. Everybody would be familiar with the constellations and the planets, because especially folks like shepherds who spent a lot of times outdoors, they would be really familiar with the shape of the constellations and what to expect. So yeah, that's our first solar system answer for the Christmas star is a conjunction. That seems, I think because we can predict where the planets are, we can also run that clock sort of in reverse to about the time that Jesus was born, and people can say if there's conjunctions, but it's not really clear that that's exactly it. Another option from the solar system is something called a comet. And this, I think, is really, people see this a lot, and that's because actually there was a famous artist who saw a comet, and then when he was painting his frescoes, these big pictures on the side of churches, he drew a comet. So that's because we know as astronomers the comet that he saw, because comets come back repeatedly. Some of them, though, take thousands of years to come back. Some, like you might have heard about Halley's Comet, take like 70 some years to come back. So yeah, we know that there's because of these big paintings and with the nativity scene, that artist drew a comet. And so a comet is a body that lives in our solar system, and it's mostly ice with some dust, like carbon dust type things. And when they get closer to the sun, what happens is that water ice sublimates, it becomes a gas straight away, and so that's what we see glowing. Comets actually aren't that big, but they make a really big trail in the sky because they spread out. So those are our solar system answers for what it could be. Nice. And then I could go even further, because they could be outside. It could be outside our solar system with a nova. And then we have a special type of nova that's even larger, and you might have heard about this because it's got the word super in front of it, and super means like extra. And so there's a couple of different ways that those supernovas can happen, but those are extremely bright. And so one of the things is a supernova is like the very end stage of a star. And so after a supernova, what's left behind we call a nebula now, and it's a supernova remnant. There might be a special type of star at the center of that called a black hole or a neutron star, but really we can see that supernova remnant. And we know that there's supernova remnants that we can find from the last few millennia. So like we know there was a really big one in 1054 that was recorded, and we now see that supernova remnant. It's called the Crab Nebula. So astronomers really don't see a supernova remnant that lines up with Jesus's lifetime, though. So I think that's the answer. I don't think it could be. That's the most dramatic answer, because when I tell you these supernovas are bright, oh my goodness, the record that we have that Chinese astronomers wrote down was that this new star was so bright they could see it during the day.
Oh, wow.
And then once the sun went down, it was still light enough outside of this was still there that you could read a book outside. It was so bright.
Wow.
So that was huge. We're really sure that's not the answer here. So there could have been lots of interesting things.
Yeah.
And so I don't know exactly what these wise men were looking for. And the Bible doesn't actually, I don't think, uses the word wise men. It calls them magi. And sometimes kings. We don't know what exactly they were looking for or why they went to Herod's palace. But what I love is the connection with the stars, that people have been looking at them for thousands of years and finding wonder, and that we can learn more all the time about the world around us, and it's truly amazing.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I know it was very interesting. We just last month got to see that comet that was out, and it took a while for us to find it because, of course, like you said, there's the light pollution out there, so it was hard, but our cameras on our phones were able to pick it up where we couldn't see it. But then I do remember, I believe it was 2020, because I felt like it was when everybody needed a little extra hope. They were thinking that they saw the Christmas star.
Yeah, there was a big conjunction that year as well.
That's what it was, because I remember it was a lining up of planets.
Yes.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's very interesting to me. But yes, thank you. I guess this last question is, why do you think it was important to reference the star or stars then, and is it still relevant today?
Well, I think it is still relevant to me today because I am really interested in stars, and I know a lot more about stars, and we all know a lot more about stars than people living in the same time as Luke, or the same time as Jesus. And stars are continually mentioned in the Bible. So stars are sort of seen as that's unchanging, and we now know that they do change, but also that Christmas is this huge change in the Bible as we move from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So sometimes when things around us are changing, it's nice to hold on to the things that don't ever seem to change.
Correct.
But sometimes we need to remember that those things we don't ever change, well, actually, there can be changes. It's just changes in stars happen on much longer timescales than our lifetimes. Right. So, I just feel it would be wonderful in my lifetime to see a supernova. and we have a few candidates for supernova that, but those are stars. It could be thousands of years, it could be millions of years.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your knowledge and your wisdom, and that's very fascinating.
I think I want to be a person who studies the stars now.
Well, if you want to be a person who studies the stars, you have to really enjoy mathematics.
Yes. That would
Good
be
to
helpful.
know.
Good to know. Well, thank you.
Really embrace that.
It's not just observing then.
No, it's not. There's lots of doing challenging mathematics.
Math.
So,
All right.
yeah.
Well, good to know. All right. Well, thank you very much for your
Yeah,
time.
you're welcome.
Have a good one.
I'm a believer.